Imagine standing on a pier in 1972, watching a ship that survived kamikaze attacks, hunted enemy destroyers in pitch darkness, and helped win the war in the Pacific, being sold for scrap metal for less than the price of a modest house today. That ship was the USS Fletcher, the very vessel that gave an entire class of 175 warships its name. And what happened to her, and to the fleet she led, is one of the strangest disappearing acts in naval history. Somewhere between glory and the scrapyard, an empire of steel simply vanished. Nobody built a museum for most of them. Nobody wrote their names into textbooks. They just disappeared, ship by ship, until almost none were left. But the story of how that happened, and why 1972 became the year everything changed, is far stranger than anyone expects. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what these ships once were. In 1939, the United States Navy sat down and asked a simple but urgent question: what does the next generation of destroyer need to be? The answer came back specific and ambitious. 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 10 torpedo tubes, enough speed to outrun almost anything on the ocean. The result was the Fletcher-Class, a design so effective that between 1942 and 1944, American shipyards commissioned 175 of them, more than any other destroyer class in history. Each one displaced roughly 2,050 tons, stretched over 376 feet, and could cut through open water at 36 knots. They were fast, they were rugged, and they were everywhere the war needed them to be. These ships fought in nearly every major Pacific engagement of the war, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, absorbing punishment that would have sunk lesser vessels and somehow surviving to fight again. At the Battle of Tassafaronga, Fletcher-class destroyers led the charge through Lengo Channel, making first radar contact with a Japanese task force in the dead of night. At Leyte Gulf, they threw themselves against battleships and cruisers many times their size, buying time for escort carriers to escape annihilation. 19 of the 175 were lost in combat. 6 more were damaged so badly they were written off entirely. That's a loss rate of just over 9%, remarkably low considering how relentlessly they were used, and a testament to just how well built these ships were. They weren't just numerous. They were trusted with the most dangerous jobs the Navy had. Then, in the span of a few months in 1945, the entire reason for their existence collapsed. Germany surrendered in May. Japan surrendered in August. And almost overnight, the largest industrial war machine the world had ever built simply stopped. Factories that had been stamping out ships, tanks, and aircraft around the clock suddenly had no orders to fill. Millions of servicemen began pouring home, eager to return to ordinary life. And the United States Navy, which just weeks earlier had been planning an invasion of the Japanese home islands, now found itself sitting on an ocean of equipment it no longer needed. By 1945, the U.S. Navy had grown into the largest fleet the world had ever seen, and almost none of it had any purpose left. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers by the hundreds sat in harbors from San Diego to Pearl Harbor to Norfolk, their crews waiting for orders that increasingly made less and less sense to give. Storage became a nightmare. Ships that had cost millions of dollars and thousands of labor hours to build now cost money simply to keep afloat, rusting quietly at anchor while accountants in Washington tried to figure out what on earth to do with them. The peacetime Navy the country actually needed was a fraction of the wartime Navy it now possessed. Something had to give. But what happened next wasn't simple at all. Inside the Pentagon and the halls of Congress, a quiet but intense argument was unfolding. Some officials wanted to scrap the surplus immediately, arguing that maintaining an oversized fleet was a pointless drain on a nation eager to shift its economy back to peacetime production. Others pushed back hard. Tensions with the Soviet Union were already beginning to simmer, and more cautious voices in the military warned that dismantling too much capability too quickly could leave America dangerously exposed if another conflict emerged. Still, others saw an opportunity. Why destroy perfectly good warships when allied nations, many of them rebuilding from the rubble of war, might be willing to buy or lease them? The debate stretched across policy meetings, budget hearings, and internal Navy memos throughout the late 1940s, and the eventual answer would end up being all of the above. Some ships were scrapped immediately. Some were mothballed in reserve fleets, tucked away just in case they were needed again. And some were quietly handed off to foreign navies, a decision that would end up giving the Fletcher-Class one of the longest and strangest afterlives of any warship design in history. For the Fletchers specifically, the timing worked in their favor, at least for a while. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the Navy suddenly needed exactly the kind of dependable, general-purpose destroyer the Fletcher-Class had always been. Ships that had been sitting in reserve were pulled back into active service. 39 were refitted under a modernization program known as SCB-74A, which reduced their gun armament to make room for new anti-submarine weapons, including an experimental system called Weapon Alpha. 18 were reclassified as escort destroyers, optimized specifically for hunting submarines. For a brief moment, it looked like the Fletchers might have decades of relevance left in them. But that reprieve wasn't permanent, and what happened next reveals just how brutally practical the Navy's decision-making really was. By the late 1950s, newer destroyer designs were already rendering the aging Fletchers obsolete. Ships like USS Daly were decommissioned as the Navy shifted its attention toward more advanced classes, such as the Forrest Sherman design. Only a handful of Fletchers received further modernization in the early 1960s to extend their service into the Vietnam War era. The rest sat quietly in reserve, their fate undecided, their steel hulls slowly aging in the salt air. And then, in the space of just a few years, around 1969 through 1972, the U.S. Navy made its final decision on what remained of the Fletcher-Class, and the story took a turn almost nobody saw coming. USS Fletcher herself, the lead ship of the entire class, the vessel that had earned 15 battle stars in World War II, more than almost any other American warship, and 5 additional battle stars in Korea, was decommissioned on August 1, 1969. What happened to her afterward is almost impossible to believe. There was, briefly, a serious effort to preserve her. The Smithsonian Institution was approached about acquiring the ship as a museum piece, a fitting monument to one of the most successful destroyer designs ever built. But funding fell through. The Smithsonian passed, and less than a year after that rejection, the ship that had led the entire Fletcher-Class into battle was sold as scrap metal, purchased on January 21, 1972, by Tai Kien Industries in Taiwan, for a price that would make any historian wince. A ship worth millions in wartime production value, reduced to its raw material worth, shipped overseas to be torn apart for parts. She wasn't alone. Throughout 1971 and 1972, the Navy worked through what remained of its Fletcher fleet in an accelerating wave of decommissioning and disposal. USS Ullman, one of the last Fletchers still in active American service, was decommissioned on July 15, 1972, and scrapped 2 years later. By this point, the pattern had become almost mechanical. Strike the ship from the Naval Vessel Register, determine its disposition, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, sell it for scrap. The high cost of upkeep, combined with the fact that many of these ships were riddled with asbestos and other materials that had seemed perfectly reasonable to use in 1942, but were now recognized as serious health hazards, made scrapping the cheapest and simplest option available. But here's the twist almost nobody talks about. Not every Fletcher met the scrapyard directly. Dozens were quietly funneled into foreign navies instead, given entirely new identities, and sent to fight under flags their original American crews never could have imagined. 14 different foreign navies eventually operated Fletcher-Class destroyers. 6 were transferred to West Germany in the 1960s, given only numbers instead of names, meant to serve temporarily until German-built replacements arrived. Instead, some remained in service for nearly 2 decades. Others went to Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Greece, and beyond. One former Fletcher, renamed Cuitlahuac after being transferred to the Mexican Navy, remained in active service until July of 2001. An almost unbelievable 59 years after the very first Fletcher-Class destroyer had been commissioned. That ship wasn't finally scrapped until 2010, condemned as a derelict and safety hazard nearly 7 decades after its keel was first laid down. The scattering didn't stop with entire ships being sold overseas. Pieces of the Fletcher legacy ended up in the strangest places imaginable. One of the 5-inch gun turrets from USS Haley became a naval gunnery monument in Brazil, a piece of American wartime engineering permanently displayed on foreign soil. A turret from a Chilean Fletcher sits on public display in Viña del Mar to this day. Fittings and nameplates from the original USS Fletcher herself, the ship that was sold for scrap in 1972, ended up preserved at the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, small fragments surviving even as the ship itself was torn apart on the other side of the world. It's a strange kind of immortality, scattered pieces of a warship living on in museums and monuments long after the hull that carried them into battle was melted down for raw steel. Even more surprising is just how few of these 175 warships survive intact today. Of the entire Fletcher-Class, only 4 remain as complete, preserved museum ships anywhere on Earth. USS Cassin Young sits in Boston, berthed near the historic USS Constitution. USS The Sullivans, named for 5 brothers who died together aboard a single cruiser, a story so devastating it changed U.S. military policy on family members serving together, is preserved in Buffalo, New York. USS Kidd, beautifully restored to her late war configuration, rests in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And in Athens, Greece, the former USS Charette, renamed Velos, remains a beloved attraction, having served in the Hellenic Navy until 1991. 4 ships out of 175. The overwhelming majority were simply erased, sold for scrap, sunk as artificial reefs, or used for target practice, their steel repurposed into everything from razor blades to automobiles to buildings that stand today with no plaque, no marker, and no memory of where the metal came from. There's something almost eerie about that fact. Somewhere, unknowingly, ordinary people may be living in houses, driving cars, or using tools made from steel that once formed the hull of a ship that hunted Japanese destroyers in the black waters off Guadalcanal. The Navy that once assembled the largest and most powerful destroyer fleet in human history didn't preserve that legacy in any grand, deliberate way. It simply moved on, the way institutions often do, focused on the next mission and the next budget cycle, leaving history to be salvaged in scattered fragments by museums, collectors, and historians decades later. What makes 1972 such a pivotal, almost invisible turning point in naval history is this. It was the year the last living link between America's World War II destroyer fleet and its active-duty Navy was finally severed for good. After that year, the Fletchers that remained in any Navy anywhere were relics, kept alive not by American strategic necessity, but by the willingness of smaller nations to squeeze a few more decades of service out of aging but reliable hardware. The ships that had once represented the absolute cutting edge of naval engineering, faster and better armed than anything that came before them, had become, in the eyes of the country that built them, simply too old and too expensive to matter anymore. And yet their legacy didn't disappear entirely. The Fletcher-Class design directly influenced the Allen M. Sumner and Gearing classes that followed, destroyers that themselves went on to serve for decades and shape the future of American naval doctrine. Modern destroyer design, with its emphasis on versatility, speed, and the ability to absorb damage while continuing to fight, owes a debt to lessons first proven aboard these 175 ships in the brutal waters of the Pacific. Every time a naval historian studies the balance between speed, armament, and survivability, they are in some small way studying a formula the Fletcher-Class helped perfect more than 80 years ago. So the next time you see a photograph of a sleek grey destroyer slicing through open water, or you walk past an old naval gun mounted as a monument in some quiet park you've never thought twice about, consider this. It might be one of the last physical fragments of a fleet that once numbered 175 ships, a fleet that fought and won some of the most desperate naval battles in human history, only to be dismantled piece by piece in scrapyards from Taiwan to Texas, its steel scattered across the world with almost no record of where it went. History doesn't always end with a monument. Sometimes it ends in a ship-breaking yard, quietly, without ceremony, while the world moves on to the next thing. What do you think happened to the rest of that steel? Where do you think it ended up? If this story pulled you in, there's another hidden chapter of World War II history waiting, one just as strange, just as forgotten, and just as deserving of being told. Subscribe so you don't miss it.